The morning of November 9, 1950, began like most mornings over the Yalu River. Cold, pale, the sky the color of old iron pressing down over the mountains of northwestern Korea. Lieutenant Russell Brown of the 16th Fighter Interceptor Squadron climbed to altitude in his F-80 Shooting Star, a straight-wing jet already considered obsolescent by the men who flew it, already outclassed by the aircraft beginning to appear in Korean skies that autumn. He did not know, as he leveled off above the brown ridgelines, that he was about to fly into a moment that would be written into aviation history. He did not know that the aircraft rising to meet him from the airfield across the Yalu had been designed with Soviet precision engineering, tested at Zukovsky, and flown south by men who believed, with every reason to believe it, that they were flying the finest jet fighter in the world. The MiG-15 that Lieutenant Brown engaged that morning climbed faster than anything he had ever seen. It turned tighter at altitude. Its cannon armament, one 37mm and two 23mm guns, carried a weight of fire that could remove a wing from a bomber in a single burst. By every specification sheet the Soviet Air Force had written, this engagement should have ended in seconds. It did not. Brown maneuvered. He dove. He used the Shooting Star's superior roll rate at lower altitudes, the one advantage his aircraft carried, and when the geometry aligned for half a second, he fired. The MiG broke apart over the Yalu River. It was the first jet-versus-jet aerial kill in the history of warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the months and years that followed that first kill will become one of the most studied and debated episodes in the history of air combat. The corridor of skies stretching from the front lines of Korea north to the Yalu River, roughly 100 miles long and 50 miles wide, would earn a name that carried weight long after the last shell casing fell into the Yellow Sea. The American pilots who flew it called it MiG Alley, and the Soviet commanders who sent their best pilots into it believed, in the autumn of 1950, that it would become a killing ground for American aircraft. They were right that it would become a killing ground. They were catastrophically wrong about whose aircraft would fill it. This is not simply the story of a better airplane defeating an inferior one. The F-86 Sabre, the aircraft America rushed to Korea in December 1950 to meet the MiG-15 threat, was not a better airplane by most objective measures. It flew lower and slower at altitude. Its armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns, while reliable and fast-firing, carried less destructive weight per burst than the MiG's cannon suite. Its ceiling of approximately 45,000 feet was several thousand feet below what a MiG-15 pilot could comfortably reach. Soviet pilots knew these numbers. They had read the intelligence assessments. They had flown against American aircraft before, in tests and evaluations, and the numbers had confirmed what they believed. This is the story of why the numbers were wrong, and of the men who understood why before the Soviets did. It is the story of a system of thought about air combat that was being built, almost invisibly, by American fighter pilots in the skies over Korea, a system that exploited not the limits of Soviet machinery, but the limits of Soviet doctrine. And it is a story of what happens when the most technically capable pilots in the world are trained to trust a method of fighting that their enemy has already found the seam in. To understand what happened over MiG Alley, you have to understand what the Soviet Air Force believed about fighter combat in 1950. And to understand that, you have to go back to the air over Germany in 1945. The Soviet Air Force that emerged from the Second World War was not the same institution that had stumbled into catastrophe in June of 1941, when the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft on the ground in the first day of Operation Barbarossa. By 1945, the VVS, the Vojenno-Vozdechny Sily, the Soviet Air Forces, had grown into an organization of staggering size and considerable tactical competence. Soviet pilots had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. They had developed genuine expertise in ground support operations, in coordinated combined arms aviation, and the kind of disciplined, structured air combat that could hold a line. What they had not developed, to the same degree as their American counterparts, was a culture of individual tactical improvisation. This was not accidental. It was philosophical. The Soviet system of air combat in 1950 rested on a principle that served it adequately against the Luftwaffe. The ground controlled the battle. Fighter pilots flew vectors assigned by radar controllers on the ground. They climbed when told to climb. They turned when told to turn. They engaged when the controller gave the command. The system was designed to put maximum Soviet air power in the right place at the right time, coordinated and concentrated. It worked beautifully in the kind of war it had been designed for, a massive, industrial ground war where air power served ground forces and where the radar picture on the ground was trustworthy and the commands flowing from it were sound. It was about to encounter something it had not been designed for. The men who arrived in Korea flying MiG-15s were not, in the main, raw conscripts. The Soviet Union deployed experienced pilots to the Korean theater under a program of deliberate concealment. Pilots who flew without Soviet markings on their aircraft, who were instructed to speak only Korean or Chinese on the radio to disguise their nationality, and who were, in many cases, veterans of the Great Patriotic War with real combat experience. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, the principal Soviet air unit operating in the Korean theater, eventually rotated more than 70,000 personnel through the conflict. The pilots who flew combat missions in MiG Alley included men who had engaged the Luftwaffe over Kursk and Kharkov, men who had flown thousands of hours and who carried in their hands the precise, economical skills of genuine combat aviators. Their aircraft was genuinely formidable. The MiG-15, designed in the bureau of Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, and powered by a Soviet copy of the Rolls-Royce Nene engine, an engine the British Labour government had sold to the Soviets in 1946, a decision that caused considerable anguish in RAF and American intelligence circles when its consequences became apparent, was one of the finest jet fighters in the world in 1950. It climbed at approximately 10,000 feet per minute at sea level, a rate the early F-86A could not match. It operated comfortably at altitudes above 40,000 feet, where the thin air made the Sabre sluggish and difficult to control. Its ceiling advantage meant that MiG pilots could choose whether to engage or disengage almost at will. If a fight was going badly, a MiG pilot could simply pull up and climb away, accelerating into an altitude band where no American jet in Korea could follow. This capability shaped Soviet tactical doctrine in MiG Alley in a specific way. Soviet pilots were trained to fight from altitude advantage. They would ascend from their high perches in coordinated formations, make slashing passes through American formations, fire their heavy cannon armament in brief high-speed passes, and pull back up to altitude to reset. The tactic was called the yo-yo by American pilots who encountered it. It was disciplined, it was geometrically sound, and it exploited the genuine performance advantages of the MiG-15 in a rational way. In theory, American pilots had no answer for it. In practice, by the spring of 1951, the kill ratio in MiG Alley was beginning to tilt in a direction that Soviet commanders found difficult to explain. The men responsible for that shift flew out of Kimpo Air Base in Suwon, south of Seoul, in aircraft marked with the checker-tailed insignia of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, a unit whose lineage traced back to the 4th Fighter Group of the 8th Air Force, the unit that had a score to be 17th over Germany and whose pilots had accumulated more aerial victories against the Luftwaffe than any other American fighter group in the European theater. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing arrived in Korea in December of 1950 with a reputation that its pilots wore with quiet confidence and occasional conspicuous arrogance. They knew they were the best. The question was whether being the best meant anything against an aircraft that could climb away from them whenever it chose. The answer came not from an intelligence analyst, not from a planner in Washington, but from the cockpit. Colonel Francis Gabreski was 40 years old in 1951, old for a fighter pilot, with a face lined by 15 years of serious flying and the residue of 18 months as a prisoner of war in Germany, captured when it had flown too low during a strafing pass in 1944 and scraped his propeller on the ground. He had 34 aerial victories from the Second World War, making him the top-scoring American ace in the European theater who had survived the conflict. He had not stopped thinking about how to fight since he landed in a German field with a bent propeller. What Gabreski understood, and what the best pilots of 4th Wing were arriving at through a process of trial and near-fatal error over MiG Alley, was something that went beyond aircraft specifications. It had to do with the nature of information in a dogfight and the cognitive demands that high-speed jet combat placed on a pilot's mind. In propeller aircraft combat, the engagements unfolded at speeds where a pilot with experience could, in a rough sense, think his way through the geometry. A Spitfire turning against a Focke-Wulf 190 at 350 miles per hour produced a visual environment that a trained eye could parse. The horizon was recognizable. The enemy aircraft was visible across a meaningful range. The maneuver options available were limited enough that a pilot's pattern recognition system, the intuitive calculus built from thousands of hours of practice, could operate within the available time. Jet combat over Korea was different in a way that nobody had fully anticipated, and that the training programs of 1948 and 49 had not adequately prepared pilots for. The closing speeds between opposing aircraft could exceed 1,000 miles per hour. The window of time in which a pilot had a viable firing solution, the fraction of seconds in which the geometry of the engagement aligned favorably, was sometimes measured in tenths of a second. The visual environment at 40,000 feet, with contrails and sun angles and the disorienting sameness of high-altitude sky, stripped away many of the reference points that propeller-era pilots had learned to navigate by. In this environment, the Soviet doctrine of ground-controlled interception, precise, disciplined, radar-vectored, had a vulnerability that was not visible in any specification sheet. It required the pilot to divide his attention between the ground controller's voice and the dynamic three-dimensional situation unfolding around him at 1,000 miles per hour. The controller on the ground saw a radar picture. The pilot in the cockpit saw the actual world. And in jet combat, the gap between those two pictures, the lag between what the radar showed and what was actually happening, could be measured in miles. The F-86 pilots of the Fourth Wing were developing something that would not receive a formal name for another decade, when a young Air Force officer named John Boyd will reduce it to a theoretical framework. They were developing an intuitive understanding of the observation orientation decision-action cycle, the loop of perception and response that govern survival in a high-speed aerial engagement. And they were discovering, through the brutal pedagogy of combat, that the pilot who moved through that loop faster than his opponent controlled the outcome of the engagement, regardless of whose aircraft climbed higher or flew faster in a straight line. The MiG-15 could climb away. But climbing away required a decision, and a decision required a moment of recognition, and a moment of recognition could be denied to an opponent if you understood how to deny it. Captain James Jabbar was 27 years old in the spring of 1951, a compact, dark-haired man from Muskogee, Oklahoma, the son of Lebanese immigrants, who had grown up in Kansas and had dreamed about flying since he was old enough to look up at the sky and wonder what it felt like. He had flown P-51 Mustangs over Germany in the last year of the war, accumulating 1.5 aerial victories before the fighting ended. Not enough to make him an ace, barely enough to give him the feel of real combat. He arrived in Korea with the Fourth Wing in early 1951 and began flying F-80SXs over MiG Alley with the methodical intensity of a man who had spent 6 years thinking about what he had not finished in Germany. What Jabbar was doing over MiG Alley in the winter and spring of 1951 was not, on the surface, philosophically complex. He was learning. He was watching. He was accumulating, with each mission, a more precise internal map of how MiG pilots behaved, when they committed to an attack, when they broke, when they climbed, when the coordination between a MiG flight leader and his wingman showed its seams. He was building, in the intuitive storage of a combat pilot's mind, a model of his opponent that was more detailed and more accurate than anything written in an intelligence brief. On May 20th, 1951, Jabbar shot down his 5th and 6th MiG-15s in a single engagement, becoming the first American jet ace in history. He had done it not by outclimbing his opponents or outrunning them, but by understanding, with a precision his ground controllers could not have provided, the moment when the MiG pilot's attention was divided, when the Soviet pilot was processing a radio call or checking his fuel or transitioning between a pull-up and a re-engagement, and exploiting that fraction of a second before it closed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Soviet commanders at the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps received the reports of these engagements with a kind of careful analytical attention that characterized Soviet military thinking at its best. They were not dismissive. They adjusted tactics. They modified formation procedures. They rotated pilots to put more experienced men against the American units that were producing the most kills. They increased the density of their ground radar coverage and refined the communication protocols between controllers and pilots. And the kill ratio continued moving in the wrong direction. By late 1951, the pattern was consistent enough that Soviet commanders began asking a question that their American counterparts had been asking about the Zero in the barracks at Rabaul 9 years earlier. Not what was wrong with the aircraft, but what was wrong with the system. The MiG-15 was not failing. The pilots were not cowards or incompetents. Something structural, something embedded in the way Soviet fighter aviation approached the problem of air combat, was being exploited in a way that tactical adjustments were not correcting. The answer, when it was eventually reconstructed from after-action analyses and the testimony of pilots on both sides, pointed to two intertwined problems. The first was the authority gradient. Soviet fighter pilots were trained to defer to the ground controller. This was not a trivial cultural constraint. It was a deeply ingrained operational reflex, reinforced by years of training, and by a military culture in which deviation from assigned procedures carried consequences that American military culture simply did not impose. A Soviet pilot who departed from his assigned vector because his own eyes told him the tactical situation had changed was not exercising initiative. He was breaking discipline. In the Soviet system, those were the same thing. The second problem was the wing-pair relationship. Soviet tactical formations in 1951 assigned the wingman a narrowly protective role. The wingman covered the leader. He guarded the leader's 6 o'clock position. He did not engage independently. He did not initiate. His function was defensive, reactive, subordinate. This meant that in a Soviet two-ship flight, the offensive capacity of the formation was concentrated in the leader. If the leader was denied, if an American pilot could force the leader into a defensive posture, the wingman's training gave him limited useful responses. He was not trained to transition fluidly into the attack. He was trained to stay with the leader. American F-86 doctrine, as it evolved to the combat experience of 1950 and 1951, moved in the opposite direction. The two-ship element, the leader and wingman combination that Jimmy Thatch had championed for the Navy a decade earlier, was a foundational unit of Fourth Wing tactics. But the relationship between leader and wingman in F-86 combat was not the purely hierarchical structure of Soviet doctrine. American wingmen were trained explicitly to call what they saw. They were encouraged to call a threat the leader might have missed. They were given a defined role in the offensive geometry of the pair, not merely to defend the leader, but to position themselves to threaten anyone who threatened the leader. This created, in the American two-ship element, a system of mutual cross-coverage that had a geometric quality the Soviet formation structure did not possess. An attack on the American leader automatically placed the attacker in a position where the wingman could threaten him, not because the wingman was necessarily a better pilot than the Soviet attacker, but because the geometry of the formation guaranteed that a committed attack on one member of the pair exposed the attacker to the other. It was, in its essential architecture, the principle that Jimmy Thatch had worked out on his kitchen table in Coronado in the summer of 1941. Translated into the supersonic, high-altitude environment of the Korean Jet War, stripped of the low-speed turning geometry of the Wildcat era, and adapted to the energy management demands of the F-86, but structurally identical. The paired aircraft, the mutual coverage, the trap that reset itself with every attack the enemy made. Soviet pilots encountered this system without a framework to name it or counter it, and they encountered it at a moment when other factors were compounding their difficulties in ways that their commanders in Moscow were not fully aware of. The quality of Soviet pilots rotating through the 64th Corps was not uniform. The veterans of the Great Patriotic War, the men with real combat experience from the German front, were present in numbers in the early months of the Korean deployment. But the rotation system meant that experienced pilots were regularly replaced by men whose combat experience was thinner. A pilot who had trained in the rigorous Soviet aviation schools of the late 1940s and accumulated considerable hours in the MiG-15 was not the same as a pilot who had learned to read a dogfight over Stalingrad. The aircraft handling was competent. The situational awareness, the intuitive pattern recognition that turned a technically skilled pilot into a dangerous one, was more variable than it appeared from the outside. The American pilots of the Fourth Wing, by contrast, were being filtered through combat in a way that concentrated experience rather than diffusing it. The pilots who survived the early engagements over MiG Alley and accumulated missions were learning at a rate that the rotation of Soviet pilots through the theater did not match. Men like Jabara, like Vermont Garrison, like Manuel Fernandez, like George Davis, who had received the Medal of Honor posthumously for an engagement in February of 1952, in which he single-handedly attacked a formation of Soviet-piloted MiG-15s that was threatening a formation of American fighter bombers, shooting down two before his aircraft was destroyed. These men were building, through repeated high-stakes exposure, a combat intuition that was becoming the tacit curriculum of the Fourth Wing. They talked to each other. They debriefed in specific detail. They built, through the informal transmission of experience between pilots in the ready room and the operations tent and the walk from the flight line back to the squadron building, a collective body of knowledge about how Soviet pilots behaved and where the seams in Soviet tactics could be found. This debriefing culture, informal, horizontal, driven by pilots talking to pilots rather than by commanders distributing doctrine, was something the Soviet system was structurally less suited to produce. Soviet after-action analysis flowed upward through a command hierarchy and produced recommendations that flowed back down. The transmission was filtered, formalized, and slow. American combat knowledge in Korea was propagating laterally between pilots at the speed of conversation. Colonel Royal Baker, who commanded the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing in 1952, put it with characteristic directness in a conversation recorded years later. The MiG pilots, he said, were good. They were genuinely skilled aviators in a genuinely capable machine. What they were not, in most engagements, was free to fight the way the fight actually was. They were fighting the fight their ground controllers told them they were in, and the fight they were actually in was never quite the same fight. The engagements that defined MiG Alley's true character did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. They accumulated, the way pressure accumulates behind a dam, through dozens of individual fights spread across months of cold Korean sky, each one adding a small increment to a body of evidence that Soviet commanders found increasingly difficult to rationalize away. The winter of 1951 into 1952 was a period when the pattern became undeniable. American pilots were not simply winning engagements. They were winning them in ways that defied the performance specifications of the aircraft involved. F-86 pilots were catching MiG-15s that should have been able to climb away. They were forcing engagements at altitudes where Soviet pilots expected to hold the advantage. They were, in engagement after engagement, arriving inside the decision cycle of opponents who were flying faster and climbing higher, and they were killing those opponents before Soviet pilots fully understood what had gone wrong. Colonel George Andrew Davis, Jr. was 31 years old in the winter of 1952, a Texan from Lubbock with a lean, angular face and the unhurried manner of a man who had long since made his peace with the specific risks of his profession. He had flown P-47 Thunderbolts over the Pacific in the Second World War, accumulating 7 aerial victories against Japanese aircraft. He had come to Korea with the 334th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 4th Wing, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had survived one air war and learned from every hour of it. On February 10th, 1952, Davis was leading a flight of F-80Xs on an escort mission over MiG Alley when his formation encountered a large number of MiG-15s. Soviet accounts suggest a number of between 12 and 18 aircraft that were positioning to attack a formation of American fighter bombers below. What Davis did in the next few minutes was not tactically complex. It was something simpler and rarer. He made a decision that most men would not have made. He turned into the MiGs, not with his full flight, alone or nearly so, breaking from his escort position to put his aircraft between the Soviet formation and the fighter bombers they were attacking. His wingmen followed. The two of them drove into the leading edge of the Soviet formation, and Davis opened fire. He shot down 2 MiG-15s in quick succession, scattering the formation, disrupting the attack on the fighter bombers below. Then his aircraft was hit, almost certainly by fire from another MiG in the melee, and went down. He did not eject. He was killed on impact with the ridgeline below. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation described his actions in a formal language of military commendation. What the citation did not and could not capture was what those two kills, in those circumstances, demonstrated about the state of the air war over MiG Alley in early 1952. Davis had attacked a numerically superior formation of aircraft that outperformed his own in climb rate and ceiling, disrupted the formation's coordinated attack, and shot down two of its aircraft before being killed. The Soviet formation, despite its numerical and performance advantages, had not been able to prevent any of this from happening. The Soviet debriefs of that engagement, reconstructed from later testimony and historical analysis, reflected genuine puzzlement. The American pilot had done something outside the parameters of rational tactical behavior. He had attacked when the numbers dictated he should not have. He had maneuvered into a firing position that the performance envelope of his aircraft suggested he could not have reached. The debrief did not produce a satisfactory explanation, because the explanation was not in the performance charts. It was in the training, the culture, and the decision-making latitude that American fighter doctrine extended to the individual pilot in the cockpit. This was the core of what Soviet commanders were failing to diagnose. They were measuring the wrong variable. They were asking what the F-86 could do, and the F-86 was telling them, by specification, that it could not do what American pilots were making it do. The correct question was what the American pilot was empowered to do that the Soviet pilot was not, and that question did not appear in any radar log or performance assessment. The kill ratio data that was accumulating in American operations rooms during 1951 and 1952 told a story that grew harder to dismiss with each passing month. The precise numbers have been debated by historians for decades, with Soviet archives open after 1991 producing figures that complicated the American wartime claims. American pilots and their commanders reported a kill ratio of approximately 10-1 in favor of the F-86. 10 MiGs destroyed for every Sabre loss in air-to-air combat. Soviet and Chinese records, when they became available, suggested the ratio was closer to 2-1, perhaps slightly better. The truth almost certainly lies between those figures, weighted toward the American side. The most careful historical analyses, drawing on both American and Soviet-era records, suggest a ratio in the range of somewhere between 5 and 7-1. By any measure, it was a striking asymmetry for two aircraft whose specifications were as closely matched as the F-86 and the MiG-15. What the ratio represented was not a mystery. Once the correct framework was applied to understanding it, it represented the compounding effect of a series of American advantages, none of them decisive individually, but collectively producing an outcome that the Soviet performance edge in ceiling and climb rate could not overcome. The first advantage was a gun sight. The F-86 was equipped with an A-1CM radar-ranging gun sight, later upgraded to the A-4 model, which automatically computed the lead angle required to hit a maneuvering target at the range the radar was measuring. American pilots could fire with a degree of geometric precision that manual deflection shooting did not provide. Soviet pilots in MiG-15s relied on a fixed gyroscopic gun sight that required the pilot to estimate his own deflection. In the fractions of a second available for a firing solution in high-speed jet combat, the difference between computed and estimated deflection was often the difference between a kill and a miss. The second advantage was the cockpit. The F-80SXS cockpit, while not luxurious, provided better rearward visibility than the MiG-15s. The bubble canopy of a Sabre gave the pilot a wider field of view behind and to the sides. In a combat environment with a pilot who saw first survived, this was not a cosmetic difference. Soviet pilots in MiG-15s had genuine blind spots in their rearward visibility that experienced American wingmen learned to exploit by maneuvering into those angles during an approach. The third advantage was the roll. At high speeds, above approximately 500 miles per hour, the F-86 rolled significantly faster than the MiG-15. The MiG's ailerons, effective and precise at moderate speeds, became progressively heavier and less responsive as speed increased, to the point where at very high indicated airspeeds the aircraft's roll rate was substantially degraded. American pilots discovered this, not from intelligence assessments but from combat, and began deliberately driving engagements to high speed before initiating rolling maneuvers. A MiG pilot who found himself in a high-speed rolling fight with an F-86 was in a fight His aircraft was not designed to win, regardless of how high it could climb. These three physical factors, the gun sight, the visibility, the roll rate, were exploited systematically by pilots who had the tactical latitude to choose when and how to fight. And that latitude was itself the fourth and most important advantage. The American pilot in MiG Alley was operating under a command philosophy that accepted, as a foundational principle, that the man in the cockpit had information the man on the ground did not have, and that tactical decisions made in the cockpit in real time were more likely to be correct than decisions made by a ground controller working from a radar picture that was always, to some degree, a simplified and lagging representation of reality. American ground controllers provided information and coordination. They did not direct individual aircraft through their engagements. The pilot who identified an opportunity was expected to act on it. The pilot who recognized that the assigned mission had become untenable was expected to exercise judgment about what came next. This was not doctrinal anarchy. It was a deliberate allocation of decision-making authority to the level where the information was best. And in the cognitive environment of MiG Alley, where the engagement evolved in seconds, where the geometry changed faster than radio calls could track it, where the difference between a killing angle and a dead-end pursuit was measured in fractions of a second, the pilot with the freedom to act on what his eyes told him had a structural advantage over the pilot waiting for a vector from a radar scope 50 miles away. Major Frederick Boots. Bless was 29 years old in 1952, a graduate of West Point who had flown F-51 Mustangs in Korea before transitioning to the F-86 and the Fourth Wing. He would end the Korean War with 10 confirmed aerial victories, becoming a double ace and one of the conflict's most successful fighter pilots. But his most enduring contribution to American air combat was not his kill total. It was a document. In 1953, drawing on his combat experience in MiG Alley, Bless wrote a manual that he titled No Guts, No Glory. It was informal, direct, and written in the voice of a man who had learned what he knew by nearly dying several times and paying close attention to the reasons why he had not quite managed it. The manual was not an official document. It was not commissioned by anyone. Bless wrote it because he believed that what American pilots had learned over MiG Alley was not being transmitted to the pilots who would fly the next war, and he was not willing to let that knowledge die with the Korean armistice. No guts, no glory describe in practical detail the principles that the best F-86 pilots of the Fourth Wing had developed through combat. It was explicit about the importance of energy management, of understanding the relationship between altitude, speed, and turn radius in a way that allowed a pilot to predict not just where he was, but where his opponent would be 30 seconds from now. It was explicit about the wingman relationship, about the mutual coverage geometry that turned a two-ship flight into something more dangerous than two individual aircraft. It was explicit about the importance of the first shot, of arriving in the firing position before the opponent recognized that the fight had begun, and about the discipline required to achieve that position consistently rather than in the random moments when fortune provided it. The manual circulated through American fighter aviation with a velocity that official doctrine rarely achieved. Pilots read it because it was true, recognizable as truth by anyone who had sat in an F-86 cockpit and tried to stay alive over the Yalu. It reached the desk of a young Air Force captain named John Boyd, who was an instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, and who was in the process of developing, from first principles and an unusual degree of mathematical rigor, a theoretical framework for the energy relationships that Bless had described from experience. Boyd would spend the next decade turning the intuitive wisdom of Korea into a formal theory of air combat that would reshape the design of every American fighter aircraft built after the F-16. But the foundation of that theory was laid over MiG Alley in the minds of pilots who had no theoretical framework for what they were discovering and who were discovering it anyway because their lives depended on it. The Soviet response to what was happening in MiG Alley evolved through identifiable phases that can be traced in the records that became available after the Cold War's end. The first phase was adjustment. Soviet commanders modified their tactical formations, altered their approach profiles, changed the timing and composition of their sweeps over MiG Alley. These adjustments were rational and professionally executed. They did not change the fundamental outcome. The second phase was attribution. Soviet analysis increasingly attributed the kill ratio disparity to factors that preserved the integrity of Soviet doctrine, American radar technology was superior. American pilots had more combat experience from the Second World War. American aircraft were more reliable mechanically. These attributions were not entirely wrong. American radar gun sights were better. Some American pilots did have more combat background. F-86 maintenance was generally more reliable than MiG-15 maintenance in the Korean operational environment. But these factors were not sufficient to explain the magnitude of the disparity, and the analysts who relied on them exclusively were explaining a symptom while missing the disease. The third phase, which came later and which the record suggests was never fully completed within the institutional memory of Soviet aviation before the Korean armistice ended the data stream, was structural. A small number of Soviet officers who had flown in the theater and who had the analytical disposition to look past the convenient explanations arrived at something closer to the truth. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was a command relationship between the ground and the cockpit, and the latitude it did or did not extend to the individual pilot. Colonel Yevgeny Popeliev was one of the most successful Soviet aces of the Korean War, credited with 23 aerial victories against American aircraft, a figure that post-war historical analysis has confirmed at a level that makes him one of the conflict's genuinely accomplished fighter pilots regardless of which side's records one accepts. Popeliev was not a man who flew by received doctrine when received doctrine was wrong. He was a kind of officer who observed what was happening in his cockpit and adjusted, who understood the importance of seeing first and acting before the opponent could react, and who practiced what he preached in the kind of direct, aggressive manner that the best fighter pilots on both sides of MiG Alley shared. In interviews conducted years after the war, Popeliev described the problem with a frankness that the institutional Soviet Air Force had not managed during the conflict itself. The American pilots, he said, fought as individuals within a formation. They made decisions. They saw something and they acted on it before checking whether the ground agreed. Soviet pilots flew the formation they were given and executed the orders they received, and in the time it took for ground to understand what was happening and issue new orders, the Americans had already killed someone. Popeliev survived the Korean War and returned to the Soviet Union. His analysis, which reached Soviet Air Force Command through the normal channels of after-action reporting, produced modifications at the margins. The fundamental structure of Soviet ground-controlled interception, the architecture that concentrated decision-making authority in the radar room rather than the cockpit, remained intact. It remained intact for reasons that had nothing to do with its tactical merits and everything to do with the institutional investment the Soviet military had made in it, the careers that had been built on it, the doctrine manuals that encoded it, and the profound difficulty any large military organization faces when asked to conclude that its foundational operating principle is the source of its tactical failures. The armistice that ended the Korean War on July 27, 1953, halted the data stream before the Soviet Air Force was forced to complete that conclusion. The MiG-15 continued to serve as the backbone of Soviet and Warsaw Pact air forces for years afterward. The ground-controlled interception system continued to be the organizing principle of Soviet fighter aviation. The lessons of MiG Alley were absorbed at the edges, tactical modifications, formation adjustments, some increased emphasis on pilot initiative in certain contexts, but the core remained. The American lessons traveled differently. No guts, no glory became required reading at the fighter weapons school at Nellis. The informal tactical knowledge of the Fourth Wing was formalized, tested, refined, and transmitted forward into the generation of pilots who would fly F-100 Super Sabres and F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and eventually F-4 Phantoms. John Boyd's energy maneuverability theory, which provided a mathematical foundation for what Korean veterans had discovered by instinct, became the conceptual basis for the design of the F-15 and the F-16. The principle that the pilot with a faster decision cycle controlled the fight, what Boyd would eventually name the ODA loop, the cycle of observation, orientation, decision, and action, was embedded in American fighter doctrine at a level of institutional depth that ensured it would survive the retirement of every pilot who had originally developed it. The numbers that emerged from MiG Alley did not stay in MiG Alley. They were studied in every Air Force that had the analytical resources to study them, and the conclusions drawn from that study shaped the next generation of fighter aviation in ways that went far beyond Korea. The Israeli Air Force, which would demonstrate in 1967 and 1970 and 1982 that it had studied the structural lessons of MiG Alley more carefully, than almost anyone, absorbed the principle that pilot initiative and tactical latitude were force multipliers that no performance advantage in an opponent's aircraft could fully compensate for. The aircraft Israel flew in those conflicts were not always superior to their opponents. The pilots who flew them operated under a command philosophy that was what the men of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing had discovered over the Yalu River in the winter of 1950 and 1951 was not, in its deepest form, a discovery about jet aircraft or radar gun sights or roll rates at high speed. It was a discovery about the nature of complex, rapidly evolving conflict and the cognitive requirements it placed on the human being at its center. The man in the cockpit had information that the man on the ground did not have and could not have in time to use. The organization that found a way to trust that man, to train him rigorously, to give him clear principles, and then to free him to apply those principles as a fight actually was, rather than as a radar said it should be, that organization would tend, over time and in aggregate, to produce outcomes that no specification sheet could have predicted. Soviet pilots and MiG-15s came to MiG Alley believing, with solid reasons, that they were flying a superior aircraft and that their system of disciplined, coordinated, ground-controlled air combat had been validated by the most destructive air war in history. They were right about the aircraft. They were right about the system's past. What they could not see, because it was not visible in any data available to them before the engagements began, was that the future of air combat, the fast, high-altitude, jet-powered future they were flying into, had exposed a seam in that system that their opponents had found and were exploiting with a consistency that no tactical adjustment was going to repair. The men who found that seam did not, for the most part, find it at a desk or in a briefing room. They found it in the specific, unrepeatable, mortal clarity that comes to a man who is in a cockpit at 40,000 feet, going very fast, and whose continued existence depends on understanding something that nobody has written down yet. They wrote it down afterward. When they could, they passed it to the pilot in the next chair, who passed it to the next, and the knowledge moved forward in that way, informally, laterally, at the speed of one generation of pilots talking to the next, until it reached a man named Boyd, who gave a structure, and the structure became a doctrine, and the doctrine became the air forces that flew every subsequent conflict the Western world would fight. The Soviet pilots who came to MiG Alley were not defeated by American technology. They were defeated by American trust. The trust the command structure extended to man in the cockpit, the trust that pilot extended to his wingman, the trust that wingman placed in the geometry of the formation they had built together. It was not a more complicated victory than that. It was also not a simpler one. The last gun camera footage from MiG Alley was shot in the final days of July, 1953, in the waning hours of a war that had consumed 36,000 American lives and vastly more Korean and Chinese ones. The footage is grainy, high contrast, the specific black and white of mid-century film stock, and what it shows is what all such footage shows: an aircraft that was flying, and then was not, pieces of it catching the Korean sun for a fraction of a second before they disappeared below the frame. Somewhere in that footage, if you knew where to look, you could see the shape of everything that came after it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.